The funeral was flawless. Flags folded. Guns fired. Cameras rolling. But just beyond the velvet rope stood a frail man in a wrinkled coat, clutching something in his hand like it was life itself. The guards told him to leave. The mourners looked away. Until the 5-star general locked eyes with him, and everything stopped. Who was this man, and why did a nation rise in silence when he spoke his first word? The wind bit through the grey morning like it wanted to keep people inside. But they came anyway, hundreds of mourners, soldiers in pressed uniforms, political leaders in black cars, and a media frenzy that couldn't stop talking about the general in the flag-draped casket. His name was General Victor Dandridge. A 5-star national icon. Decorated. Admired. And now, gone. The funeral was planned down to the second, broadcast live, lined with ceremonial guards, and strictly invite only. At the far edge of the cemetery, just past the last checkpoint and beyond the view of most cameras, stood a man who didn't belong. He wore an old trench coat that didn't quite fit and held a battered brown envelope in one trembling hand. His shoes were muddy. His eyes distant. Security noticed him right away. "Sir, you can't be here," one of the soldiers said. The man nodded but didn't move. When asked again, he simply lifted his eyes and said, "I came to pay respects." But he had no invitation. No badge. No proof of connection to the general. Just his word and that old envelope. He was small, hunched by time, and clearly didn't pose a threat. But protocol was protocol. 2 guards stepped forward to escort him away. "This is a closed service, sir," one said more firmly this time. "No exceptions." The man didn't argue. He didn't even resist. He just stepped back, turned toward a lonely tree on a small hill nearby, and quietly found a spot where he could watch from a distance. He held onto the envelope like it was breathing. He blinked slowly, perhaps reliving memories only he could see. People arriving through the main gate barely noticed him. Some did, though. A few murmured. A woman whispered to her husband, "He looks familiar." A reporter raised a camera, then hesitated. Something about the old man's posture seemed sacred. Sacred, and maybe broken. None of the top brass paid attention. Why would they? They had medals to pin, flags to fold, and orders to bark. They didn't see the man watching the ceremony like it was the last thing he'd ever do. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. But something about his stillness began to make others restless. A young soldier guarding the perimeter kept glancing over. Eventually, he stepped away from formation and walked toward the man. "Sir, do you know General Dandridge?" The man nodded again. "We served." The soldier furrowed his brow. "What unit?" The old man smiled, almost sadly. "One that doesn't have reunions." Then he turned back to the ceremony. The soldier stood there, unsure. He could have called it in. Could have pressed. But instead, he saluted quietly and stepped away. The funeral began. Music swelled. The crowd hushed. But on that hill stood the forgotten figure, unseen by the world, watching a man be honored, while he remained erased. But for the first time in decades, the past was beginning to stir. The small house at the edge of the woods had no name on the mailbox. It hadn't for years. Paint peeled off the porch railings, and vines crept up one side of the walls like they were trying to wrap the place in secrecy. Inside, the rooms were quiet. A black and white photo sat on the mantel, a younger version of the man at the funeral, wearing a uniform with no insignia and standing beside someone who looked strikingly like General Dandridge. The photo had been taken before the medals, before the silence, before history chose who it would remember. His name was Harold Miles. He lived alone, rarely spoke, and no one in town really knew much about him. He was polite but distant, always paying in cash at the grocery store and never staying long enough to make conversation. Kids whispered that he had once been a spy, or maybe a ghost. He never confirmed either. The truth was more complicated. Harold had once been part of something that didn't exist on paper. In the late 1960s, he was recruited into a covert operations unit so secret that even its codename was erased after the Cold War ended. They went into jungles no map recognized, crossed borders they were told not to cross, and made sure things never made the news. General Dandridge had been their commanding officer back then, But back then, they were just names on paper. Dandridge had ambition, always talking about what came next, what rank, what medal, what speech. Harold, on the other hand, followed orders. Not because he believed in all of it, but because he didn't want anyone else getting hurt. Their missions were classified and deadly, the kind of things that never made headlines but kept the world from tipping over. But one mission changed everything. They were sent to extract a diplomat from hostile territory. Things went wrong. The diplomat was killed. Harold took a bullet to the leg while covering their retreat. Dandridge made a call, one that left 2 of their men behind to die. When Harold confronted him, Dandridge responded coldly, "There's no glory in dying for ghosts." That was the last time Harold saw him up close. When they returned, Dandridge climbed the ranks, smiling on magazine covers. Harold was quietly discharged. No pension. No ceremony. Just a handshake and an agreement to forget. And he did, for years. He worked odd jobs, moved to the country, and told people he was a retired mechanic. But the nightmares never stopped. And he never threw away that envelope. Inside it were letters, reports, and a single photograph. Proof of the operation. Proof of what really happened. It was never about revenge for Harold. It was about memory. About truth. About not letting the past rot in silence. Still, he never spoke of it. Not even when his wife died. Not even to his son, who joined the military not knowing his father had once served. The silence became part of him, like an extra layer of skin. Only when he saw the news about Dandridge's death and the state funeral did something shift inside him. He knew it was time. Not to cause a scene, but to be there. To stand witness. To see if, even in death, Dandridge could acknowledge what he'd buried. Harold packed the envelope, put on his old coat, and caught the first bus into the city. No one noticed him on the ride. He sat near the back, hands folded over the envelope like it was his heartbeat. As the city skyline grew closer, his fingers trembled, not from age, but from the weight of remembering. He didn't expect anything. He didn't want applause. He just needed to be there. To look at that casket and know the truth hadn't died alone. In his pocket was a letter he'd written years ago but never mailed. It was addressed to Dandridge. But it wasn't filled with anger. It was filled with questions. Why did you leave them? Why did you climb on their backs? Why didn't you tell the truth? He never planned to give it to anyone. But he brought it anyway. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need a reply. It just needs to be heard. And now, as the ceremony played out before the world, Harold stood quietly on that hill, waiting. Not for forgiveness. Not for recognition. Just for something real. The music played softly through hidden speakers, the haunting notes of a military band drifting across the cemetery like smoke. Rows of soldiers stood at attention, every movement sharp and exact. Dignitaries arrived by the minute, escorted through the gates with polished shoes and solemn faces. Photographers knelt and clicked their shutters, capturing the perfect farewell for a man the nation called a legend. Cameras focused only on what was meant to be seen. Behind the line of vision, behind the red velvet rope and the sharp stares of the Secret Service, Harold stood in silence. His feet were planted on uneven ground, the heels of his shoes sinking into the soft dirt as he watched the ceremony unfold from the hill. He had not moved since being turned away. His hands gripped the envelope tighter now, like he could feel the pages inside pushing to be read. But no one looked in his direction anymore. No one even glanced back. A woman in uniform approached the barrier closest to him. She was younger, with bright eyes and a chest full of medals. She glanced at Harold, then at her tablet, then back at him. "Name?" she asked sharply. Harold gave it. She searched. "Nothing. You're not on the list," she said. "This space is for dignitaries, confirmed family, and command staff." He nodded slowly. "I understand," he said, the same calm in his voice that had confused the guards before. "I just want to be here. That's all." She frowned, unsure what to do. Rules were rules, but there was something in his voice that made her hesitate. Still, after a moment, she stepped back and called for another guard to relieve her. She didn't want the responsibility of deciding. A few minutes later, a senior officer strode toward Harold, flanked by 2 younger soldiers. His jaw was tight. "Sir, I've already been informed about you," he said without introduction. "You need to leave the grounds. This is not an open event." Harold didn't argue. He never did. "I understand," he said again. "But I served with him. Long ago. I just want to watch." The officer leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Sir, if you don't leave, I'll have to involve law enforcement." Harold didn't react. He looked past the officer, to the casket, now surrounded by pallbearers. "You know, he wasn't always a general," Harold said quietly. The officer's eyebrows pinched. "Excuse me." Harold's lips curled into a tired smile. Once, he was just Vic. Just a scared boy in a jungle, trying to be brave. The officer stared at him, confused. "Sir, I'm going to ask you again." Harold lifted his hand, cutting him off. "I'll move. Just, let me stay until the flag folds." The officer didn't respond. He turned and walked away. Harold took that as permission. He moved slightly down the hill but stayed outside the roped perimeter. The envelope never left his hands. Every now and then, he glanced down at it, like it might whisper something to him. Across the field, more high-ranking guests arrived. The president's car pulled in. A full military flyover loomed. Still, Harold stood alone, invisible in plain sight. People nearby began whispering. One man pointed at Harold and muttered something to his wife. A reporter asked a crew member who he was. No one knew. But his presence was starting to bother people. A pair of guards walked over again, this time more assertive. "Sir, this is the final warning," one of them said. "You are not cleared to be on any part of this property." Harold looked at the young man. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. "I'm not here to cause problems," he said. "I buried better men without cameras. I just want to see this one go." The young guard hesitated, then called someone on his radio. Moments later, another officer appeared, this one older, decorated, and clearly in charge of something important. He scanned Harold with a look that said he'd made up his mind before he even arrived. "Who are you?" he asked. Harold gave his name. "Never heard of you," the officer replied. "And you're not on the records." Harold slowly opened the envelope, holding it just slightly toward the man. "That's because some stories don't get told," he said. The officer didn't even glance at the papers. "Security will escort you out," he ordered, then turned and walked away. The guards moved in. Not roughly, but firmly. Harold took a step back. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't plead. He just looked at the casket and whispered, "You said they wouldn't forget." One of the guards paused. "What did you say?" Harold looked at him, his eyes sharp despite his age. "He made a promise once. A long time ago. That the ones who didn't come back wouldn't be lost to history. That someone would remember." The guard didn't respond. The crowd began to shift as the flyover roared above them. Cameras turned to the sky. Applause rose like thunder. No one saw the old man being guided slowly away from the hill. No one saw him stop, turn, and stand still one last time. But someone did. Someone important. And in that moment, something changed in the air. The ceremony continued without pause. At the podium, a colonel delivered a speech about duty, sacrifice, and honor. His voice echoed through the perfectly arranged chairs, past the carefully trimmed hedges, and over the heads of those who nodded solemnly but listened with half a heart. Most were there out of obligation. Some out of respect. A few out of ambition, already imagining the headlines their attendance might earn them. Cameras swept across the scene like searchlights, capturing only what had been approved in the event script. But outside that frame, near the shadow of a dying oak tree, Harold stood frozen. The guards who had warned him now stood nearby, unsure what to do next. They had orders to remove him, but something in the way he stared at the casket made them hesitate again. His face didn't show anger or protest, it showed something else. A pain older than war. A loyalty that hadn't rusted, even when the world moved on. High above the ceremony, an American flag flapped against the wind, its edges frayed just enough to remind everyone that glory has a cost. At the front of the crowd, seated behind rows of generals and foreign diplomats, was the man everyone had been waiting for. General Russell Vance. The only living five-star general. A legend in his own right. Decorated across 4 wars. A name whispered in history books and shouted in barracks around the world. He was known for his discipline, his silence, and the fact that nothing ever made him flinch. Until now. As the colonel continued speaking, Vance's eyes scanned the perimeter. He wasn't really listening. He had been distracted since he stepped out of the car. Something in the air wasn't right. Something that wasn't on the schedule. He saw the man. Not clearly at first, but enough to notice what others had ignored. The trench coat. The posture. The envelope clutched like a final breath. Something in that still figure struck a memory deep in the general's mind. A flicker of a campfire in the jungle. A voice shouting through the rain. A hand pulling someone from the mud. He blinked, squinting harder, until the old man's face came into view. And then it hit him. Like a punch to the gut. Like a memory that breaks through years of carefully stacked silence. Vance's jaw tensed. His heart began to pound. He knew that face. Knew it in a way that no camera or record ever could. That wasn't just a man watching a funeral. That was a ghost. A living one. And suddenly, everything around him felt off. Too clean, too planned, too rehearsed. The words at the podium stopped making sense. The sounds of the crowd faded. All he could hear was his own breath. Without warning, General Vance stood. He didn't announce it. He didn't wave or make a scene. He simply rose, buttoned his jacket, and stepped forward. One of his aides moved to stop him. "Sir, your remarks are next," the aide whispered. "Protocol says." Vance cut him off with a stare that silenced more than words ever could. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, he left his seat and walked away from the podium. The colonel paused mid-sentence, confused. The audience stirred, murmuring. The cameras turned, some unsure whether to follow. No one knew what was happening. Except Harold. He watched as the most powerful military figure in the country walked toward him, step by step, across the grass. The guards at Harold's side stiffened. "Sir," one of them muttered into his radio, "we have a situation." But no one moved. No one dared to. The general approached slowly. Not with anger. Not with confusion. But with something like shame. Like memory pressing down on his shoulders. He stopped a few feet from Harold, the space between them thick with tension. The crowd had fallen into a strange silence, like they sensed something important was unfolding but couldn't name it. Vance stared at the envelope in Harold's hand, then at Harold's face. His voice, when it came, was low but clear. "You kept it." Harold nodded. "Someone had to." The general looked away for a moment, as if trying to hold back years of locked-up truths. "I thought you were gone," he said. Harold shrugged. "In some ways, I was." The general's eyes dropped to the grass, then slowly lifted again. "Why didn't you come sooner?" Harold didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice trembled just slightly. "Because I was waiting to see if anyone else would remember." The general stood still. Then, in front of the entire gathering, in front of cameras, world leaders, and uniformed men who had never seen him break rank, he raised his hand in a salute. Not to the casket. Not to the flag. But to the old man standing alone on the hill. Gasps echoed through the crowd. The colonel at the podium fell silent. The camera crew froze. The image was sharp, raw, and unscripted. A five-star general saluting a man who no one recognized. Except now, they all wanted to know who he was. The general didn't say another word. He just held the salute, his eyes locked on Harold's. In that moment, it wasn't about rank or protocol. It was about something lost being remembered. Something unspoken being acknowledged. Then, with the ceremony still on pause and all eyes watching, the general turned toward the podium and said firmly, "This service stops until this man is heard." Time didn't just stop, it cracked open. The moment General Vance raised his hand in salute, the air turned heavier. Reporters lowered their cameras as if unsure whether they were allowed to film what was happening. The funeral, once a perfectly choreographed state event, had gone off script in a way no one dared to interrupt. Soldiers looked to their commanders looked to each other, and the crowd of mourners seemed to collectively hold its breath. Harold stood there, motionless, the envelope still clenched in his hand. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't asked for it. But here it was, the salute he thought he'd never see again. Not for him. For what he represented. For the voices that had vanished without medals, without parades, without even graves to mark their place in history. General Vance lowered his hand and turned to the podium. His voice, when it came, was calm but commanding, the kind of voice that had launched troops into battle and shut down arguments with a single sentence. "I know this wasn't part of the program," he said. "But this man here, Harold Miles, served this country in ways most of us will never understand. And I will not let this ceremony go on while he is treated like a stranger." Murmurs rippled through the crowd like wind through grass. A few people whispered his name. Others began to remember stories, rumors, about a unit that never officially existed, about missions in countries that never made the news. The general gestured for Harold to step forward. For a second, Harold hesitated. His feet felt like stone. But then, slowly, he moved toward the center of the gathering. The sea of uniforms parted for him. Vance extended a hand and helped him up the platform. "Would you like to say a few words?" the general asked. Harold looked out at the crowd, at the rows of cameras, the faces watching. "No," he said quietly. "I didn't come to speak." The general nodded, understanding. "Then let me speak for you." He turned to the microphone, cleared his throat, and began a speech that had not been written or approved. Most of you knew General Dandridge as a hero, a man who wore his stars with pride. But before all of that, he was part of something darker. Something forgotten. There are men and women who do their duty in silence, without glory. Harold Miles is one of them. He paused, glancing at Harold again. The truth is, Victor Dandridge never would have lived long enough to wear those stars if this man hadn't pulled him out of a war zone 40 years ago. And no one ever thanked him. Not once. The crowd listened, silent. Some teared up. Others looked down in shame. "I served with Dandridge. I respected him. But he made choices that left others behind. And the man standing here today, he lived with the weight of that. While the rest of us were promoted, decorated, remembered, he faded away. Not because he wasn't brave, but because his bravery was inconvenient to history." Harold shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the attention, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. The general continued. "There is no military regulation that can undo that kind of silence. But today, we break it. Today, we honor a man who saved lives, who kept secrets, and who never asked for anything in return." He turned toward Harold again. "On behalf of a nation that should have never forgotten you, I offer you this." He removed one of his own stars, an actual brass insignia from his uniform, and pinned it gently to Harold's coat. A hush fell over the crowd. The symbol of the highest rank, now worn by a man with no official record. The cameras captured it, unsure how to caption the moment. Harold looked down at the star, his eyes wet, though no tears fell. "This doesn't change the past," he whispered. "But maybe it makes it a little quieter." Vance nodded, eyes glistening now. "And maybe it makes the future louder." The general stepped aside. One by one, soldiers in the front row stood and saluted Harold. It started with a handful. Then the rest followed. A wave of honor rolled through the cemetery. The guards who had blocked him earlier now stood at attention. One even removed his cap. The colonel at the podium stepped back without a word. It wasn't his ceremony anymore. It belonged to something older than protocol, respect. Somewhere in the crowd, a young cadet snapped a photo. That photo would become the cover of next week's magazines. The man who stopped a funeral, they would call it. But that wasn't the truth. He didn't stop it. He gave it meaning. By the time the flyover finally returned for a second pass, the ceremony had taken on a new tone. Not scripted. Not polished. But real. Families cried not just for the general, but for the ghosts who'd never had funerals of their own. And Harold, now standing beside the casket of the man he once saved and once lost, finally let go of the envelope. He handed it to General Vance, who tucked it into his coat with the care of someone carrying a sacred object. History, once silent, had spoken. And the whole world listened. The sun had shifted by the time the last words of the funeral were spoken. It dipped lower behind the hills, casting long shadows across the white chairs and empty podium. Most of the crowd had dispersed, some still whispering, some in silence, unsure how to process what they had witnessed. History had taken an unexpected turn. But not everyone left. A few people lingered, drawn to something they couldn't name, something they didn't want to walk away from just yet. Harold remained by the casket. General Vance stood with him, the two men barely speaking. No more cameras flashed. No more speeches echoed. The ceremony was over, but something deeper was just beginning to settle in the air, like the final breath of a story too long held inside. The envelope was gone, tucked safely into the general's coat, but what mattered most wasn't on those papers. It had always been in what was never said. Vance finally broke the silence, his voice low and rough. "They'll ask questions now. About that mission. About you." Harold nodded, eyes fixed on the flag-draped coffin. "They'll dig through the records. They won't find much," he said. "The truth was buried long ago." The general sighed. "Not anymore." Harold looked at him, tired but calm. "They'll want to know why I never came forward. Why I didn't stop him sooner. But it wasn't about stopping him. It was about seeing if he'd ever stop himself." Vance didn't answer right away. He looked down at the brass star still pinned to Harold's chest. "He never did." Harold's shoulders slumped. "No. But I think he wanted to. At the end, maybe he did." The general shook his head. "He was complicated. But that doesn't excuse the silence." Harold placed a hand on the casket, fingers trembling. "No, it doesn't. And silence is heavy. It follows you. It takes pieces of you the longer you carry it." There was a long pause between them. Finally, the general said, "Why did you come today? Why now?" Harold took a breath. "Because I was tired of being a ghost." He looked around, at the soldiers packing up flags, at the aides folding chairs. This was supposed to be his final chapter. But I needed to know if anyone remembered the prologue. The general nodded slowly. "They will now." But Harold shook his head. "Not all of it. Some parts need to stay in the dark. Some truths don't belong to the public. They belong to those who lived them and to the ones who didn't come back." His voice lowered. This wasn't just about Dandridge. It was about Henderson, Ruiz, Patel, Simmons. Names no one remembers. I came for them, too. The general stood straighter. Then maybe today wasn't a funeral. Maybe it was a roll call for the forgotten. Harold smiled faintly. Or a wake-up call. A few minutes later, Vance turned to leave, but Harold didn't move. He stood by the casket for a long while, eyes closed, lips moving silently. No one heard what he said. No one ever would. When he finally walked away, his steps were slower than before, but lighter. Like something had been lifted. Not all of it. But enough. He didn't speak to reporters waiting by the gate. He didn't wave to the guards who now stood in quiet respect. He just passed through them like mist, leaving behind only the image of a man who had shown the country a truth it hadn't asked for, but needed to see. Back at home, Harold unpacked nothing. He didn't need to. The envelope was gone. The weight of it had been transferred. He made a pot of tea and sat by the window, watching the wind move through the trees. He turned on the old radio and listened to the news. His name was being said now. Across networks, in headlines, on talk shows. "Mystery Man halts state funeral," one said. "General salutes ghost soldier," read another. But none of them got it right. They talked about the salute. They showed the photo of the pin. But they missed what mattered. That none of it had been about glory. It had been about memory. About making sure silence didn't win. What the public didn't know, what wasn't printed, was the moment that happened right before Harold left. The general had asked him one final question. "Did he ever say anything about you?" And Harold had looked down at the coffin and said, "Just once." Vance waited. What did he say? Harold hesitated. He said, "If anyone ever asks, tell them I owed him everything. But I never paid it back." Vance had nodded, the truth finally catching up to them both. But that moment stayed off the record. It was too personal. Too real. It belonged to two men, and to the ghosts they carried. And so, the funeral became more than a farewell. It became a mirror. A reminder that history is shaped not just by those who are remembered, but by those who are forgotten. That silence doesn't mean absence. And that sometimes, the most powerful story is the one almost no one hears. Harold Miles faded again after that. No interviews. No memoirs. But his name, once missing from every roster, was finally etched into a quiet plaque at the base of the cemetery hill. No ceremony marked its installation. Just a small brass plate that read, "For those who served in silence, and those who spoke when it mattered." Below that, one name. No rank. No title. Just a truth that could no longer be ignored.